Start now. So, Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and thank you all for attending this lecture. Brother Safwan is going to give us a very important lecture, actually, on a very important topic regarding the Qira'at of the Quran. So, the different ways that the Quran is read. You might have come across this topic in your masjid when you're praying behind the Imam and he reads a word slightly differently from the way you're used to. You might not question it, you might question it a lot, but today that lecture will be around those differences and what they mean for us as Muslims and how we approach them and what they really are. So, again, Assalamu alaikum, Brother Safwan, and you can take it away.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته جزاك الله خير. Alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam ala Rasulullah. Amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dear brothers and sisters, and welcome to this talk in the series of talks related to the preservation of Quran and Sunnah. Quran is the literal word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his final revelation to humanity. It has produced the largest and most diverse civilization ever to exist on Earth. And for 1.5 millennia, it has been recited, memorized, and practiced by millions of human beings across the globe. Entire libraries of books have been devoted to the study of text, its revelation, preservation, recitations, and interpretations. In fact, unlocking the Quranic text was the main objective behind the development of diverse Islamic studies and the fields we see today. Yet, one aspect of Quran is to astound and puzzle research, and we will attempt to
Assalamu alaikum, brother. Your voice is cutting out.
it must have be in our hands. Is it better now?
Yes, but maybe turn off the camera to make sure that it doesn't repeat.
Simple explanations of what reading Qira'at or readings mean, and then look into Ahruf, its meaning and explanations. Then add a layer to what we've already seen about the history of the Quran in the previous lectures, and that is the layer of tenet and what they are and how they spread in the Muslim world as we know today, the wisdom behind them, and then we'll look at some examples of those differences. We will then take and dispel a few misconceptions related to the topic, the preservation of the Quran and different recitations. So let's get into it. Why should you study this? This is important because the concept is not super intuitive to those of us for whom the history of the transmission and canonization is not super clear. The knowledge that the Quran can be recited in various ways itself begs few questions, right? If the Quran is truly one timeless, unchanged book, then how can it be read in multiple ways? Why do some people recite the Quran differently? And how do we know whose recitation is correct? Where do these differences come from? What are the meaning behind these multiple readings and how many are there? And why do opponents of Islam focus on this? So we'll attempt to answer some of these questions over the course of this talk today. Qira'at are not small or insignificant phenomena that are irrelevant to us today. They have historically played an important role in accommodating dialectical differences among the Arab tribes. And they've been drawing academic attention in the recent years due to their importance in accessing under researched areas of the Quran. More importantly, the Qira'at continue to expand and enrich our experience as readers with the revelation. We should study this because its study extends beyond just recital renditions or tafsir traditions to uh, broad topics such as the theological conceptions of the Quran, its inimitability, and the authenticity. Uh, it also critically contributes to our understanding of the Quran, primary source of Islamic law. Now, what is Qira'at? Difference. A reading or recitation in Arabic is called qira'ah, and the plural is called qira'at. Qira'ah or a reading is one way to read a verse. A reading system or qira'at, therefore, is a collection of rules and descriptions of how to read all the verses in the Quran. Qira'at can be said to be the verbalization of the Quran, how we recite it. And so the Quran is essentially preserved in qira'at. We have 10 qira'at today, meaning 10 different reading systems. Just like there are pioneer scholars in other disciplines, four imams of fiqh, six imams in hadith, and so on, there are also scholars in Islamic history who mastered the recitation of the Quran. They became popular for the readings they transmitted from their teachers, from the companions of the Prophet, and the ways we recite the Quran today are named after these famous scholars. Now, the Qira'at utilize different rules which can be broadly categorized into two. The first type of difference is usul, the differences regarding the prolongation and intonation and pronunciation of the words that are applied throughout the Quran. And the second type is furush, the differences in the letters or vowels of particular words in individual passages in the Quran. Now, the words of the Quran can be divided into two as a whole, those that can only be read in one way, which constitutes majority of the Quran, and those that can be read in multiple ways, which constitutes the basis of the Qira'at. Let's look at examples of each. In the first example, the famous Hafs and Asim, and we'll look at what these mean, what we mean by Hafs and Asim, Khalaf and Hamza, but these are just different reciters or different qira'at. Hafs and Asim recites, as we know, Sirat al-Ladina an'amta alayhim ghairil maghdubi alayhim waladdallin. And instead of the widely recited kasra, another reading, Khalaf and Hamza, recites it as alayhum instead of alayhim. The meanings don't change in this case, the case of usul, and the pronunciation differences like this are applied in similar places throughout the Quran. But in specific places in the Quran, these differences cause the meaning of the word to change. This is the case of furush you see here in the second example. With a single vowel change, the word changes from maliki to maliki. But the ultimate message still does not change. Instead, it adds a layer of meaning and beauty to the verse. Now, coming back to the question, if every single word in the Quran is Allah's unchanged revelation and chosen on purpose, where are these different words coming from? Every single word is undoubtedly a miraculous, unchanged revelation from Allah. The Qira'at are not random changes. These are the ways Muslims have been taught to recite the Quran since it was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ. We know that the Quran was revealed to the Prophet over 23 years, and every Ramadan, the Prophet used to review the entire Quran with Jibril. One important aspect of this is the famous hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ says, "O Jibril, I have been sent to an illiterate nation among whom are the elderly woman, the old man, the boy and the girl, and the man who cannot read a book at all. Jibril says, O Muhammad, indeed the Quran was revealed in 7 ahruf. Now, this hadith about the 7 ahruf is widely attested and multiply transmitted from the earliest period in Islamic history. The Quran was taught in different ways since the time of the Prophet, and this tradition was under the approval of the Prophet himself. The differences in the recitation are quite subtle, although they sometimes enrich and expand the meanings, as we saw in the example uh, before this. It is important to note that we cannot understand the history of the during the prophetic time without an understanding of the centrality of the Quranic recitation and memorization in Muslim ritual practice in daily lives. Since the early days of Islam, Muslims were eager to learn and study the Quran, and the Prophet ﷺ, encouraged his companions to learn the Quran and teach it to others. Since many readings are mainly linguistic diversity in pronunciation of some words, it's very important to understand the linguistic nature of the Arabian society at the time. Arabs spoke different dialect, and this was reflected in the recitation of the Quran under the approval of the Prophet himself in the light of the license of the 7 ahruf. This permission made the Quran more accessible and easier for recitation. And this concept of different dialects still exists until today. Moving on, now that we are familiar with the term Qira'at, let's look at Ahruf in a little more detail. In another hadith in Bukhari, the Prophet says, Jibril recited Quran to me in one harf, and then I requested to him to read it in another harf and continued asking him to recite the Quran in another harf until he ultimately recited in 7 harf. We have another famous example of how Umar radiallahu anhu reacted to Hisham ibn Hakim's recitation. He says, I heard Hisham reciting Surah Al Furqan during the lifetime of the Prophet. I listened to his recitation and noticed that he recited in different ways which the Prophet had not taught me. I was about to jump over him during his prayer, but I was able to contain myself. And when he completed his prayer, I put his upper garment around his neck and seized him by it and said, Who taught you the surah which I heard you reciting? He replied, The Prophet taught it to me. He said, You are wrong, for the Prophet has taught it to me in a different way from yours. So he says, I took him to the Prophet and said, O Messenger of Allah, I heard this individual reciting Surah Al Furqan in a way that you did not teach me, and you have taught me Surah Al Furqan. The Prophet said, O Hisham, recite. So he recited it in the same way as I heard him recite it before. On that, the Prophet said, it was revealed to be recited in this way. Then the Prophet said, Recite, O Omar. So I recited it as he had taught me. The Prophet then said, It was revealed to be recited in this way. The Prophet added, This Quran has been revealed to be recited in 7 ahruf. So recite it whichever way is easier for you. So what does ahruf actually mean? There are over 40 different interpretations of the word, but most of the scholars agree that the 7 ahruf are not the 7 qira'at. They also agree that the 10 qira'at we have today are part of the 7 ahruf, but not all of them. And they also agree that the 10 qira'at comprise the contents of the Quran as conveyed by the Prophet to his Sahaba. Now, instead of going over some of the individual opinions, we will take three concepts that encompass the overwhelming majority of them. The first is that the 7 ahruf are basically a reflection of dialectical diversity. This implies that the Quran encompasses 7 of the most eloquent Arabic dialects at the time of the Prophet. Now, the view is strong, but there are things that weaken it. There are no authentic reports stating that those particular seven dialects are the ones that the Quran was revealed in, because Al-Wasiti mentions 50 Arabic dialects used in the Quran, with the Quraysh being most frequent. We've already seen the story of Omar and Hisham reading it differently, and they were both from Quraysh. And the Qira'at today consists of more than seven dialects. So there's element of truth in this argument, but also things that are not consistent with the evidences we have. An example of dialectical pronunciation difference in the Quran is imala. Imala is a sound between alif and ya. It exists in most canonical qiraat, but is mostly present in readings like Hamza and Kisai. And there is one place in the recitation of Hafs and Asim that the word imala is used, and that is in marjeha. So we don't majreha, sorry. We don't recite it as majraha or majriha. We recite it as majreha. So imala refers to the inclination of uh, of the word. Uh, Different styles of imala exist, and it showcases how the Quran covers distinct dialects, which accommodated the diversity of the Arabs. Now, another example is takhfif al-hamza, which is lightened articulation of hamza. Some Arabs used to do this in different styles, like lightening or tasheel, substituting or ibdal, or omitting it altogether, and so on. This, in addition to accommodating again the dialectical diversity, it also makes one's articulation of the Quranic words more eloquent. And the example of this is Ja'a Amr, Ja'a Amrana versus when you exclude it or when you pronounce them together, Ja'a Amrana. Now, the second concept that is that these are seven modes of variation. Several scholars like Ibn Qutayba, Ibn al-Jazari held this view, and this is one of the other stronger opinions. However, there are points again that weaken it. In this, that there are the variations, the different variations that different scholars have set differ from each other. So there are no reasons to point out that why would one scholar select a specific seven variation. For instance, Abu Fatr al-Razi has seven different types of variation. Ibn Qutayba mentions seven different. And also the wisdom in which the Ahruf concession came down was to make it easy for people to recite the Quran. So it's related to the issue of pronunciation. And the seven modes that some scholars mention are referring to writing instead of recitation. For instance, some examples of these type of variation includes the different type of nouns, singular, dual, plural, masculine, feminine, or verb forms, past, present, future, imperative. These refer more to writings instead of pronunciation. And the third option that sort of consolidates all the other opinions and is held by Dr. Abdulaziz Abdul Fattah Al-Qari. And he says that al-ahruf as-saba is al-wuju' as-saba. He says that the word seven is literal here, and this is seven forms of recitations. So seven forms of variations. And referring to how the word is literal here and not metaphorical, he says that the different recitations in a word can be seven maximum. Doesn't mean that it will necessarily reach seven for every word. And please also note that the recitation of the Quran is of two types, right? The first is where all of the Qurra agreed upon, so there's no difference in reciting it. Then there's and that is the majority of the Quran. And then there are places where there are differences. So those differences he's referring to, they don't reach more than seven. Sometimes they could be three, sometimes they could be four, but not more than seven. And he also mentions that these variations are not related to synonyms. Like the examples that are mentioned several times by in several works, different tribes used to use different words for the command come. Like halumma was used, akbil and udnu was used by different tribes, all of it just to mean come. But this is not the type of variation that this is the qiraat are restricted. To summarize all of this for a short explanation, one of the easiest ways to explain this is that the term seven is symbolic. It's an Arabic term used to denote the concept of many. Note that the number seven and its denominations, like 70, had symbolic usage for the Arabs to denote many. Like Allah says in Surah Tawbah, if you should ask forgiveness for them 70 times, never will Allah forgive them. The meaning of the verse is that no matter how much you ask Allah to forgive them, He won't. Not that He might if you go over 70. Based on this opinion, there is no difference between the term ahruf and the term qira'at. This means that the Quran was meant to be read in different ways. Now, another way to look at it, a little more advanced, is that ahruf can be explained simply as ways of varying. So one can say that the seven ahruf are all the categories of variation to which the differences found within the Qur'an can be correlated. In other words, they represent a menu of ingredients from which each qira selects its profile. Sheikh Ammar Khatib, who's a scholar of Quranic sciences based in Canada, in Manitoba, explained this with the pizza analogy. So you can imagine all the different ingredients that makes up a pizza as the ahrufs and each qiraat as the final products. That is different pizzas, each of which have a set of ingredients. So a lot of ingredients are common, you know, and then there are some different selected toppings. Now, the why of it is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to make it easy on the companions to recite the Quran in a way that it was natural to them. So the Prophet taught and approved all of these different ways of reciting to different companions, and eventually they were codified into the official Qira'at that we know today. It is important to note that the ahrufs are harmonious. What do we mean by this? Allah says in Surah Nisa, verse 82, do they not reflect upon the Quran? If it had been from other than Allah, they would have found within it much contradiction. Al Jassas mentions in his work, commenting on this verse, he says, contradictory meanings do not exist in the Quran altogether. Rather, all the apparently contradictory differences are perfectly coherent in meaning and wisdom. Ibn al Jazari also mentions that the reality and the benefit of the differences among the ahruf established by the Prophet is that they are differences of complementation and harmony, not contradiction and inconsistency. Indeed, contradiction or inconsistency cannot possibly exist in the speech of Allah. So the Ahruf Hadith establish that the Quran is inherently a multi-form recitation. Although each concept may not independently explain the totality of the seven Ahruf, together they provide a holistic understanding of the ways in which different pronunciations of the Quranic text are permitted. As the translated vertical ethnic background, while uh, people were still illiterate. These dynamics caused the Muslim community to need one Quran teachers, since the Prophet
So you're cutting out for this slide.
people's varying linguistic customs and mental capacities.
Let me see if
Better now.
yes, if you could repeat the slide.
So the Prophet's plea to Allah to ease Quranic recitation, as we saw in the hadith before, was probably prompted by the uh, gives different ethnic backgrounds, and people were still much illiterate. Now, these dynamics caused the Muslim community individually new Muslims. Uh, there were cultural accommodations needed mastering detailed citation. To address the first need, the Prophet teachers such as Ibn Jabal, Ubay ibn Ka'ab, and others, Ubadah ibn Samit, man came to him to embrace Islam. He would assign one of us to teach him Quran. And to address the second need, the Prophet asked Allah to ease the recitation of the Quran for his ummah. Hence, the seven Ahruf were the result of the prophetic request, which was honored by Allah, which indicates that the Ahruf are in part a concession or rukhsa to ease the readings of Quran for all Muslims. To put the history that in context, this concept really requires internalizing how Quran was read. Jibril's declaration. Okay. Let me switch back to the history. Um, to understand the transmission of the Quran, we should understand that the uh, Jibril's declaration that Quran it, it also means that the primary way.
So I still not working.
My connection for a second. Is it working now?
Yes, better.
Okay. So the primary way to learn these ahruf was through transmissions connected to the Prophet's direct teaching or approval. The Prophet taught the companions the Quran according to the Ahruf by either reading to them, called Iqra, or correcting their recitation to him, or Arz. Now let's look at what these two words mean. Iqra means that he recited it to a companion who then recited the same part back in the same manner. So quite simple. Ad, on the other hand, means the companions recited to the Prophet what they had previously learned from him to verify, review, and correct their recitations. Kind of like when you're trying to memorize the Quran with the teacher. Ard has historically been the primary method of transmitting the Quran, although it is a method that is shared with other disciplines such as Hadith transmission. The Ard of the Quran required unique conditions, that it must be from memory, that it must be recited to another person, that is, for instance, an instructor, and it must follow general and specific rules of accuracy or zabt. The Prophet would also sometimes approve people's tribal pronunciation of certain words or letters. Most of these differences are related to the this affirmation is also supported by the event that several people representing different tribes recited Quran to the Prophet, and every one of them differed in the language in which they recited. The Prophet approved the readings of all of them. Now, one important point before concluding this part is a question. The hadith related to the seven ahruf has reached a level of tawatur. There are a lot of different chains that it reaches us with today. But why is there not one narration that has incited the meaning of the word ahruf as-saba? This is because the Sahaba understood what the Prophet meant by it. They knew it by necessity. Because we have several narrations where we see the Sahaba ask Rasulullah what something meant if it was not clear. And they asked Rasulullah what is al-wahan, right, in the famous hadith of wahan. So this was likely not something that they needed to ask later on. And when we know that when the companions disagreed and felt confused, the Prophet taught that there is a legislated ruksa that accommodates people's dialects, which makes it easy for more and more people of different tribes and age and mental capacities and so on to recite the Quran. And he eliminated the ambiguity by actually practically reading and teaching them in different modes. And thirdly, he taught them that these differences are not contradictory. So, to summarize the concession of seven ahruf, it's important to note that irrespective of which definition of ahruf is adopted, of scholarly consensus that even that the seven ahruf resulted in different yet equally valid readings, and the different opinions helps us understand that reading in any of the seven ahruf is permitted and that all of them are correct, not as variants of a fixed original text, but rather as recitations of a singular but multiform text. And this leads us to the next section of how we got from Ahruf to the Qira'at. That is the history of canonization of the Qira'at. We'll start with the transmission during the time of the Prophet. Throughout the Quran, Allah frequently commands the Prophet to recite it to others. Mentions it in Surah Al-Ma'idah, Surah Anam, Shura, and a lot of different places. In addition, there are multiple verses that attributes the responsibility of reciting the Quran to the Prophet in a declarative sense. Now, this conveying the Quran through recitation includes the fact that the Prophet did not read or write, nor did the majority of at least the initial recipients of his message. This made oral delivery via accurate articulation and commitment into memory, the primary method of transmission. The Prophet also encouraged written documentation and appointed official scribes, but he maintained verbal delivery as the primary method, even after much of the Quran was written. Now let's take a look at how the teachings of Quran looked like during the time of the Prophet. The Sira and Hadith literature illustrate how the Prophet applied the two method of Iqra and Ard in his pursuit of every opportunity to teach the Quran to his companions. We'll try and quickly go through all of these different teaching styles. He would instantly recite it, conveyed the Quran to his companions as it was being revealed. There's a hadith, for instance, in Muslim that after taking a nap one day among his companions, the Prophet suddenly raised his head and he was smiling. Upon being asked about the reason for his smile, he said, just now this surah was revealed to me, and recited Surah Al-Kawthar to them. So the companions were able to witness the Quran's revelation firsthand. He would also recite it to those he was inviting to Islam. As one of the first people to embrace Islam, Abu Bakr invited five of his companions to meet the Prophet and listen to the Quran. Who were these five? Uthman ibn Affan, Zubair ibn al-Awwam, Abdurrahman ibn Auf, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, Talha ibn Ubaidullah. We know that these five not only became Muslims, but they were among the 10 who were promised paradise. Uh, taught Surah Yusuf and Surah Alaq to some companions when they came to him in Mecca to embrace Islam. And it was a constant practice of the Prophet to immediately direct new Muslim to read and learn the Quran. And he would not prioritize anything else over it. Then he would recite the Quran to people as in the mosque while traveling. If the verses were revealed, he asked Ibn Masud to recite to him one on one on different Quran. He would recite the Quran out loud on a daily basis. And then in Juma, in fact, Hadith books have dedicated chapters to Prophet's recitation in prayers, identifying the surahs that he would frequently recite in specific prayers. Sermons. His sermons offered a platform for repeatedly reciting verses as well as broadcasting newly revealed ones. Companions have reportedly memorized Surah Kaf from his sermons due to how frequently he would recite it. Um, in the 9th year of Hijrah, after the Battle of Tabuk, the Prophet wanted to perform Hajj, but he did not feel comfortable doing so while people would still do tawaf around the Kaaba naked. During that time, the first part of Surah Tawbah was revealed. So he sent the first 40 verses with Abu Bakr, who he appointed as the leader for the Hajj season, to be recited by Ali to pilgrims. We have report that Ali recited the verses to every group of people he could reach there. He would ride his mount and go to the areas where Hajj rituals were being performed and read them until, as he describes, his voice gave out. The Prophet would assign companions to teach new Muslims. Several companions were appointed by the Prophet to teach new people coming from different places the Quran. We have reports of companions teaching one another. The companions who immigrated to Abyssinia used to read, review, and study the Quran together. It was, in fact, profoundly present in their interactions and debates with the Abyssinian Christians. when the famous verse of Dawah of Al Imran was revealed, say, O people of the scripture, come to a word that is common between us and you. The Prophet sent it to Jafar ibn Abi Talib, who was one of the leaders of the Abyssinian Muslim residents, and asked him to use it among the other verses that he was using in his conversations with Christians. He sent Musa ibn Umar to teach the Quran to Ansar. Musa ibn Umar came to be known as the Muqri. There, he would go around the city visiting houses of Al Ansar, inviting them to Islam and teaching them the Quran. Muad ibn Jabal was also commanded by the Prophet after the conquest of Makkah to stay in Makkah and teach the people Quran. The Prophet would have the military leaders remain in the areas they were fighting in to teach new Muslims Quran. In the 10th year of Hijrah, the Prophet sent Khalid ibn al-Walid to Najran and commanded him to invite them to Islam, and if they became Muslim, to stay among them and teach them Islam and the Quran. And there are other examples of group learnings. He encouraged group learning. Dar al-Arqam was the first place, secret place of gathering for Quranic learning from the Prophet for 3 years. One of the most important educational sites where several companions learned how to recite the Quran and memorize many surahs was Al-Sufa. This sheltered many companions who could not afford housing, and their main occupation was learning and teaching the Quran as well as practices of the Prophet. So it was not only a welfare shelter, but also a school for Quran's memorization. Um, the Prophet used to actually deploy many of them, the people of Sufa, to different tribes to teach them the Quran. Now, if you look at all of these together, this is beautifully summarized in the report of Qatada when he says, I said to Aisha, O mother of the believer, tell me about the character of the Messenger of Allah. Uh, Aisha said, have you not read the Quran? I said, of course. She said, verily the character of the Prophet of Allah was the Quran. And after the Prophet passes away, the companions continued this legacy of Quranic education, and their students numbered in thousands. Ibn Umar narrates about his father, Umar ibn al-Khattab. He says that while sitting on the pulpit, while the immigrants and Ansar were surrounding him, he was teaching them the religion and the Quran as a teacher teaches children. An-Nafrawi said that the first to gather children in the Maktab was Umar ibn al-Khattab. He ordered Sahabi to commit to teaching them Quran, and he assigned him a salary from the Bait al-Mal. And there were different types of students among the children, intelligent and not so much. He ordered the Sahabi to write for the unintelligent ones on the tablet and only teach the intelligent ones without writing. So the Quran programs and schools for children that we know today as Maktab across our different communities are fruits of Umar's contribution to Quranic education. And many other companions were themselves Quran experts. Abu Darda was the leading Quran teacher of the Damascus Mosque with more than 1,600 students. Abu Musa al-Ashari was appointed as an envoy to Basra, and he also taught Quran there. Despite the difficulty of assuming a public office, he was known for his daily Quran recitations and teachings. He organized the classes, and he directly supervised the teaching assistant in the Basra Mosque. And Ibn Masud spent 22 years in Kufa teaching Quran and fiqh to numerous students. The famous revolution against the Umayyad was led by a group known as the Army of the Qurra, which comprised 4,000 of Ibn Masud's students and their students. Now we'll move on. During the time of Abu Bakr, we see the same zeal and concern from the companions regarding the transmission and preservation of the Quran. Although the Quran had been written down by many scribes during the lifetime of the Prophet, a complete compilation had not yet been assembled when he passed away in 11th Hijri. So why was it not compiled, you might ask? Well, setting up a single volume or single manuscript might have proved challenging. Any divine naskh abrogation, which were revealed subsequently, would affect the legal provisions and wordings of certain verses, required proper inclusion. A loose format that they had during the time of Abu Bakr. This allowed for the insertion of, and the time of the Prophet before that, this allowed for the insertion of new verses and new surahs because the revelations did not stop until a short time before the Prophet's passing away. So his passing away meant that there would be no more verses, abrogations, or rearrangements. So the situation was perfect for the compilation of the Quran into a single unified volume. Um, and the companions were cautious and they hastened to take up this task. And this is what served. Yes, I think somebody raised.
Yes, you can unmute.
I guess I'll continue. Um, So, what prompted Abu Bakr's compilation? We have a narration from Zayd ibn Sabit suggesting that the martyrdom of many Quran reciters during the Battle of Yamama was the direct reason that Umar became concerned. May Allah be pleased with them. And he shared his concern to the Khalifa at the time, Abu Bakr, who appointed Zayd ibn Sabit for the compilation. Moving on to Uthman ibn Affan's compilation, the early Muslim community witnessed a rapid expansion of the Islamic empire thanks to series of victories against the Byzantine and the Persians. By the time of Uthman ibn Affan, the Islamic empire had extended from North Africa to Central Asia to the frontiers of the Indian subcontinent, and the vast number of new Muslims were in dire need of those who could teach them the Quran, and the companions appointed individuals well versed in the recitation of the Quran to travel to distant lands to teach it to them. Many senior companions, as we know, themselves left Medina and took up residences in different cities to serve as the Quran teachers. While the companions understood that the Quran had been revealed according to the seven Ahruf and therefore it could be recited with a certain degree of variation permitted by the Prophet, this concept was not really familiar to the new Muslims who were, new converts in the newly conquered lands. So this naturally led to disputes when some people rejected the readings of others, as Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman raised this concern to Uthman, and he told him about the disputes between the people of Iraq and Sham, who disputed about each other's readings. So Uthman sent a message to Hafsa. By the way, the Abu Bakr's Suhuf, the manuscript that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu had compiled, was eventually kept with Hafsa. And during the time of Uthman, he sent a message to Hafsa saying, send us the manuscript of the Quran so that we may compile the Quranic materials in perfect copies and return it to you. So she sent the copy she had to Uthman. He then ordered Zayd ibn Sabit again, Abdullah ibn Zubair, Sa'ad ibn As, and others to rewrite the manuscripts in perfect copies. And he said to these companions, in case you disagree with Zayd ibn Thabit on any point in the Quran, then write it in the dialect of Quraysh, because the Quran was revealed in their tongue. And they did so. And when they had written the many copies, Uthman returned the original manuscripts to Hafsa. And he sent to every Muslim province one copy of what they had copied, and ordered all the other Quranic materials, whether written in fragments or whole copies, to be burnt. Let's note some important points on the difference between Abu Bakr and Uthman's compilation. Abu Bakr's goal was to prepare a standard official copy of the Quran, as during his time the entire Quran was written down but not compiled into a single codex. The focus here was to ensure the preservation of the Quran. By doing this, he made sure that the verses remain intact and there's no additional removal. And he also allowed, though, for the personal copies of companions to exist. On the other hand, in the case of Uthman's compilation, the objective was to unite the entire Ummah upon a single text to eliminate confusion caused by the variant readings. As we see, the Muslim nation had extended to Far East. Muslim gained huge victories over the Persian and Roman empires. People from different tribes had embraced Islam. People used to recite according to the dialect of their teacher. When they gathered during their battles, they differed in their recitation. So, fearing issues with this, Uthman transcribed those parchment into a single mushaf and limited the dialects to the dialect of Quraysh. His argument was that it was revealed in that dialect, even though the recitation was brought into dialects other than theirs initially to ease the difficulty and hardship. He saw that the need for that had ended and thus restricted it to one dialect. Here we have to understand an important point. Initially, the rukhsa was needed as people from various Arab tribes and places were embracing Islam, and it would have been difficult for them to recite in a single dialect. So there was a rukhsa. When the non-Arabs uh, embraced Islam, for them to recite the Quran in any of the dialect would require the same effort. So the original rukhsa was not necessarily required. Thus, the end of the need. Though this process, we see the beauty and wisdom of Allah and the timeless nature of the Quran. But the question arises, when Uthman did his compilation, did he collect all the ahrufs? From his instruction to the committee, it is evident that he commanded them to adhere to the dialect of Quraysh when they differed. And majority of the scholars like At-Tabari, Ibn Qayyim and others are of the opinion that Uthmanic manuscript was compiled according to one harf. Tabri states that because the diverse reading were a concession and therefore it wasn't an obligation for Muslims to learn and transmit them all. The other opinion is that it does contain some of the variations of the seven haruf, and this is more likely the case because Uthmanic manuscript did not have diacritical marks. It did not have the dottings either. So in some cases, more readings can take place. Uh, a classical example is that of Surah Hujurat, where if you remove the diacritical marks, we have the different readings as Fatabayyanu versus Fathabbatu. Now, to sum up, Ibn Hajar explains that what remained after the Uthmanic compilation were the differences from the other ahruf that could still be accommodated by the skeletal text of the Uthmanic codices. So what remained, in other words, were some of the differences of the ahruf, but not all of them. Lastly, Uthman sent out the copies of this mushaf to the major cities along with a reciter to teach them. Thus, with his compilation gathering the ummah on a single mushaf, we see the fruits of this effort today as we are all united upon a single mushaf. Now, the Qira'at as we know them today are reflections of the rukhsa of the seven ahruf as in the Uthmanic Mus'haf. They are not synonymous with the ahruf. Instead, they are systemized recital modes that preserve many of the ahruf and accommodate dialectical diversity in line with the Prophet's teaching and the compiled copies of his companion. However, concerns that the rukhsa might be fluidly interpreted and applied prompted the companions to compile the Quran for the third and the final time during the time of Uthman. Uh, and the companions and successors' early effort to establish this criteria ensured a consistent foundation to the variants. Now we'll divide the history of the Qira'at into 5 stages, different centuries, the first 5 centuries, final compilation of the Quran, standardization of the selection process of the Qira'at, establishing criteria for the authentic reading in the 3rd century, standardization of the 7 readings, and then in the 5th century, the 10 Qira'at and their transmitters. The process of compilation of the Quran in written form developed across the time of the Prophet himself, who had expert scribes, and the caliphates of his successors, Abu Bakr, Omar, and Uthman. In Abu Bakr's stage of compiling the Quran, 2 witnesses were required for each verse to be included, meaning either 2 companion or a combination of memorization and written documentation. The compilation was finalized during the time of Uthman, with the companions unanimously approving his decision to destroy or correct all other copies of the Quran. The need to protect the Quran from potential distortion triggered his decision to again standardize the codex. It's important to note that the preservation of the Quran relied on both oral as well as the written transmission. The companions did not merely rely on their memorization and personal manuscripts, and the skeletal script of the Uthmanic Codex accommodated multiple readings, as we have mentioned. And in the first century leading into the second, the biographies of the companions and their successors tells us that hundreds of them were Quran teachers distributed across the Muslim world. Some of the dedicated Qurra from the companions had numerous students, and those became links in thousands of chains of Quranic transmission. The transmission authority of those companions solidified the ordering of the variant Qira'at and synchronized the structure of the reading systems. We call them ikhtiyar, which are attributed to the 10 Qurra. An ikhtiyar was named after a reciter, a qari, if he systemized a mode of phonetic principles, usul, regarding articulation, inclination, and so on, as well as the furush. So if a reciter had a system of usul and furush, he would have, we could say that he had an ikhtiyar. For instance, An-Nafi says, I read the Quran to 70 from the Tabi'in and I scrutinized them. What 2 of them had agreed on, I would adopt it, and what was transmitted by only 1 of them, I would abandon it. So a reading of so and so does not mean that the Qari after whom it is named invented it. Rather, it means that he narrated the Quran from many companions or successors that mastered the dialectical pronunciations and eventually systemized a mode to adopt and teach. The method of ikhtiyar evolved for the sake of practicality and consistency. Since each of the early Qurra learned from several teachers, several companions or the students, but sought to teach their students in a uniform manner. So most of us, when we study Tajweed today, we study the usul and farsh in the riwayah of Asim within that, for instance. A reading of Asim means that Asim narrated the Quran from many companions or successors, mastered the pronunciations, and eventually adopted a system, a mode to teach to his students. Going into the 3rd century, a lot of different ikhtiyars, different modes of transmissions or teaching emerged towards the end of 1st and the 2nd century. The majority of the Qurra upheld the set of qualifications for any ikhtiyar to be deemed authentic. In this standardization process, Ibn al-Jazari systemized the 3 conditions for any ikhtiyar to be considered Quran. And that was that the authentic chain of transmission should exist. The Qira'at should conform to the rasm of the or the writing of the Uthmanic Codex, and it should conform to the rules of Arabic grammar. And And isnad's lack of credible transmission, or failing to follow any of these three conditions, would quote unquote decanonize it or render it shadh or anomalous. Even though only a handful of companions were widely known for their dedication to Quranic teachings, the number of ikhtiyar kept increasing due to the increasing demand for teaching, by the increasing Muslim population. So early Qira'at work documented a large number of canonical readings, but by the 4th century, the Quranic scholars sought to standardize the various ikhtiyars based on how popular they were, how much were they recited in different settings and teaching spheres. Most Qira'at represented 5 regional Quranic schools: Medina, Makkah, Basra, Sham, and Kufa. These regional schools represented the most authentic Quranic authorities because they were the regions from which the knowledge of the prophethood of Quran, tafsir, hadith, fiqh, pertaining to both inward and outward practices, actually originated. Out of sincere commitment to Ibn al-Jazri's conditions that we saw earlier, that makes a qiraat acceptable, Muslims began to limit the number of readings to a popular ikhtiyar of the righteous, knowledgeable Imams. Ibn Mujahid, a leading Qiraat authority of his time, and the master of the discipline, was the first to limit the number of canonical readings to 7. In explaining his approach and motives in standardizing the readings, he said, the Quranic readings adopted by the people of Medina, Makkah, Kufa, Basra, and Sham is the readings which they orally received from their predecessors. One man from each of these regions who learned from the successors was committed to that reading, and all the public and the elite agreed to his reading, followed his mode of recitation, and abided by it. Now, following Ibn Mujahid's approach, scholars in the 4th and the 5th century added 3 more qira'at, which match the same criteria of the 7 qira'at. So the standardization of these 10 qira'at does not mean that these Qurra were the only experts of such caliber. In fact, hundreds of other prominent Qurra existed throughout history, but the systemization process eventually settled on 10 Qurra, and that's the takeaway point here. These were the most advanced students of various companions and successors. They were notable jurists, and they devoted most of their lives to the Quran. Now, what you see here is the list of 10 Qurra which are known across the Muslim world, listed in the order presented to Qiraat students today. I'll just quickly go over each of them. Nafi, based in Medina, was a public inspector. Imam Malik called him the Imam of the people. He described his method of developing his mode of recitation. We saw already, says read to 70 from the Tabi'in, scrutinized what they had read. If two agreed on it, I would adopt it, and I would abandon what was transmitted by only one of them. Ibn Kathir was a scholar of hadith and law, and he was appointed as a judge in Makkah. Abu Amr was also a leading scholar of hadith and Arabic. And Ibn Amr was known in the Sham as Al-Imam. Though he did not meet or see the Prophet, he obtained the highest Quranic isnad from the 10 Qurra. He directly learned from several companions, including Abu Darda. In fact, he ranked highly among Abu Darda's 1,600 students, and he actually assumed Abu Darda's teaching position after his passing away. And he also became the Imam and the chief Qari of the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus during the time of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. And Umar ibn Abdul Aziz would pray behind him. And he was also appointed as the judge of the city, which was at that time the capital of the caliphate. Now, Asim was born during the Prophet's lifetime, and he had met 24 of the companions. He was blind, but he had one of the best voices of recitation, and his reading was influenced by the readings of Ibn Masud and Ali ibn Abi Talib. Hamza al-Zayyat was a merchant of oil, hence the title Zayyat, and he was another leading Qari in Kufa. His reading is reportedly the most common reading in the mosque of Kufa. Imam Abu Hanifa was a contemporary of his, and he testified that he was, meaning Hamza was superior to him in Qira'at and inheritance. Al-Kisai was another grammarian. He was appointed the chief Qari of Kufa after Hamza, who was his teacher. So Al-Kisai is Hamza's student, and a lot of thousands of students would attend Al-Kisai's classes, and he would sit in his chair and read the entire Quran while the students corrected their readings and pronunciation according to his recitation. Abu Ja'far was one of the earliest Qurra and Nafi's teacher. He was known as the Imam and the chief Qari of Medina, and he learned the Quran from Ibn Abbas and Abu Huraira. And as a child, he reportedly visited Salama, the wife of the Prophet, who would wipe over his head and made dua for him to be blessed by Allah. Yaqub became the chief Qari of Basra after Abu Amr, and he was one of the experts on Ahruf and its differences, and he in fact authored books on Qira'at. And last but not the least, Khalaf was also one of the two canonical transmitters of Hamda, and as a Qari of the 10, he is often called Khalaf the 10th. His isnad is connected to Hamza and Asim, and his reading resemble the other Qaris of Kufa. Now, as we mentioned before, the 10 canonical readings were systemized via chains of narrations, all of which are associated with a group of Qurra from the companions through proper isnad requirements. Among the most famous companions who read the entire Quran with the Prophet and memorized it are Uthman ibn Affan, Ali ibn Abi Talib, Ubay ibn Ka'b, Zayd ibn Thabit, Abdullah ibn Masud, Abu Musa al-Ashari, and Abu Darda. And the list here shows the isnad connection between the 10 Qurra and these 7 companions. Now, the list here is like sequenced in the order of who read to the number of Qurra who read to the companion. So you can see the number keeps on decreasing. Ubay ibn Ka'b is attributed to the most of students. We'll move on. Now that we have understood the Qira'at, we'll look at what the riwayah are. Each Qari of the 10 is designated by Qira'at scholar 2 canonical transmitters who were basically their most popular students. And these students or 2 canonical transmitters are called Rawis. This explains the difference between a reading or Qira'ah and a narration or riwayah. When we read the Quran, we usually reference the riwayah, not the Qira'ah. For instance, Asim's 2 canonical Rawis are Shu'bah and Hafs. Hence, when we assign a mode of reading, we say reciting according to Hafs and Asim or Hafs from Asim. Riwayas of the same Qari may differ in both their usul and first. Hence, each Rawi adopted a consistent mode from his teacher. And here you see the list of 2 famous student or Rawis for each of the 10 Qaris. And this concludes our section on the history of how we got to the 10 Qira'at and the 20 Rawis. Moving on to look at Qira'at and its significance again. Are they all Quran? Restating that the Prophet recited and taught the Quran in multiple ways, all the readings were authentically systemized by generations of pious predecessors, and the conditions that the scholars of Qira'at set for a reading to be authentic apply to all of them. And the variations of usul and furush are all harmonious, not contradictory. The hadith of seven ahruf is widely attested and multiply transmitted from the earliest period. Now, this grounding in tradition permits us to use the Qur'an to not only recite the holy text in a dialect that is easier for us, but also to better understand its spectrum of meaning and range of legally coherent interpretations. So we can ascertain that the Quran is preserved in Qira'at and they are all Quran. Another interesting point, did the traditional scholarship prefer some Qira'at over others? Um, the short answer is that they did. But the fact that they gave preference to some Qira'at over others did not really stem from a disagreement over the preservation of the text of the Quran or the authenticity of a particular Qira'at. In fact, most of these discussions relate to the dialectics of the Qira'at, you know, authenticating the historical accounts from the masters of the language, examining the grammar, rhetorical analysis of their variances, and so on. For instance, Makki ibn Abi Talib says the scholars might prefer what both Asim and Nafi agreed on, since the readings of these two Imam are the most credible, authentic, and eloquent. Another opinion that Ash-Shakwi has is if the variant acquires high standards of eloquence, compatibility with the Mus'haf, and the approval of the majority of the Quran readers, it will be chosen reading for most of them. Given the Qira'at's critical role in defining and transmitting the Quran, they also intersected with the uh, discipline of fiqh. Even though no school of law, no madahib officially adopted a particular reading, we see that the founders of the madahib and their succeeding jurists did explicitly favor certain readings over the other. For instance, Imam Malik reportedly considered Nafi's reading Sunnah. Imam Shafi describes Ibn Kathir's reading as our reading. Imam Hanifa, Abu Hanifa adopted reading and isnad that resembles the reading of Asim through Hafs, and so on. And in fact, also the narrations from Ahmad ibn Hanbal shows preference for Asim, Hafs, and Abu Amr. What about the scholars of tafsir? In the introduction of his tafsir, Ibn Ashur rahimahullah says that the 10 canonical mass transmitted qira'at may vary in terms of what some of them uniquely include in terms of rhetoric or eloquence or popularity. However, all of these are convergent variations. And after citing scholars who upheld the validity of preferring some qira'at over the others, he shows how basically these preferences relate to syntax, dialects, and principles of transmission, but they do not necessarily negate the authenticity of the Quran or the canonicity of the Qira'at. Now, let's look at how the Qira'at spread in the Muslim world throughout history. By the 5th century, Kufa transitioned from the riwayah of Hafs and Shu'bah to the reading of Hamza. Basra settled for that of Yaqub. Sham landed on Ibn Amir's reading, and later on Abu Amr's reading. And worse, because he lived in Egypt and was its chief qari, his riwayah prevailed there until the 5th century. Later on, by the 10th century, Duri and Abu Amr became the dominant reading across the board. Iraq, Hijaz, Yemen, Sham, Egypt, Sudan, and East Africa were all dominated by Duri and Abu Amr. Ibn Ashur mentions what's popular today. So until a few decades ago, he passed away in 1973, I believe. He says that Qalun and Nafi was resided in some parts of Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. Persian Nafi in some parts of Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, West Africa, and Sudan. Interesting history of how Hafs and Asim became the most popular Qira'at um, today. It was actually the one of the least widespread Qira'at for the majority of the Islamic history until a couple of centuries ago. Like we mentioned, Duri and Abu Amr was the most widespread for over 10 centuries of our history. And the reason for this huge change was somewhat due to its tajweed rules, but mainly historical context. And what do I mean by tajweed rules? The use of Fusha became less and less typical, and it was replaced by the regional dialects among the Arabs. And so finding the easiest way to recite and read the Quran properly was necessary. Also, because of the growing number of non-Arab Muslims, learning the Quran from the most consistent rules with the least exceptions was the way to go. And Hafs and Asim sort of fulfills both of these criteria for several reasons. But uh, to to explain it, it suffices to say that learning Juz Amma is quite enough to learn how to read the entire book with this Qiraat. And that's not the case with the other Qiraat, Warsh, for instance. There are more rules and context that you need to understand. And the historical context is that during the time of the Ottomans, the Qira'at of Hafs and Asim was adopted as the official Qira'at, including in the Arab countries. And more importantly, when the printing started, the Ottomans used also the same Qira'at for consistency in its writing rules, which made the Quran easier to print. Now, people would get the Mus'haf as gift when they went for Hajj. And any guesses of what Qira'at was used for the first ever recording of the Quran? It was Hafs and Asim. Now, what is the wisdom behind the Qira'at? What do scholars say? Imam al-Qastalani says that the scholars never ceased to extract from every reading of a Qari meanings that are not found in the other readings. This is the divine wisdom manifest in the Qira'at, which perform a variety of functions that ultimately enrich our experiences with the Quran. A few of those include the ease of recitation and memorization for Muslims who come from different backgrounds. This easing helps non-Arabs by allowing them to recite in a manner befitting to their abilities. The Qira'at accommodates the dialectical diversity of historic Arabs to soften their hearts towards accepting Islam. And one of the important wisdoms the scholars have mentioned is that Allah has honored the Ummah of the Prophet ﷺ by revealing the Quran in seven different ahruf. The Quran is the only divine book that was revealed in this manner. And this goes on to demonstrate that just as Allah promised, the Ummah did not fail to preserve the Quran in all of its precise forms of pronunciation. And no other Ummah was granted this blessing. It also increases our chance to diversify our engagements and the type of engagements we can have with the Quran. Because this is a whole thing. You can spend years understanding, learning, and appreciating the Qira'at, and people do it. Qaris who have ijazas in more than one recitation are highly respected among the Muslims. The Qira'at also show that Quran's brevity is such that it somehow generates a universe of meanings, and these meanings are conveyed through same verse variations rather than multiple verses. It proves Quran's transcendent nature by facilitating different modes of recitation without contradictions between them. The Qira'at variations complement rather than contradict one another, working in sort of tandem to represent one form. And last but not the least, Qira'at actually assist with legal interpretations of the verses by clarifying their meanings and expanding or restricting their application. And this takes us to the differences in the Qira'at. Now, some of the wisdoms behind the Qira'at variations we just mentioned shows its relevance to tafsir. And the tafsir tradition is full of discussions on Qira'at and how they augment the meaning of the Quran. These discussions derive from different uh, interdisciplinary scholarships on divergent meanings, tawjih, different case endings, i'rab, or different preferences. Ibn al-Jazari categorized the differences of the qira'at. So, how can the qira'at differ? Into three: uh, difference in wording without a change of meaning. For example, what we already saw, the word, actually, we didn't see this. The word Sirat uh, um, in Surah Al Fatiha is pronounced with Seen and Saad. So the difference here is purely dialectical and there is no change in the meaning. The second type of difference is the difference in both wording and meaning, but the possibility that both meanings are can be simultaneously applied. For example, Malik and Malik in Surah Al Fatiha indicates master and king. Both of them refer to Allah and they can both be applied at the same time. The third type of difference is in both wording and meaning, but only one meaning can apply at a time. So they are harmonious in perspective without contradiction. And we'll look at some of the examples in the next few slides. So in Surah Al Baqarah, Allah says, they ask you about wine and gambling. Say in them is great sin or much sin and benefits for people, but their sin is greater than benefit. Now, 8 of the 10 Qurra read it as the word as kabirun or great, but Hamza and Al Kisai read it as kathirun, meaning much. Now, this variation type is an alternation called ibdal of two consonants. So the ba turned to tha. Now, the uh, act of drinking wine, according to the first reading, is great, or the sin of drinking wine, according to the first reading, is great, and the second reading adds the meaning that there is much sin in it. Now, in discussing the first reading, Al Farrah says that the great sin of drinking wine is obvious, that it causes animosity and hatred and impairs one's rational faculty, which affects their understanding of the rights of Allah. In discussing the second reading, Kathirun, Abu Hayyan says that uh, describing the sin to be much can be understood in three ways. First, it might refer to the sinners, meaning drinking causes sinning among people and every consumer of it is sinful. Second, it might refer to the consequences of drinking, that is, the deviant actions and sayings of a drunk person. Third, it might refer to all the individuals involved in its manufacturing and distribution. Based on the hadith, Allah has cursed wine, its drinker, its server, its seller, its buyer, its presser, the one for whom it is pressed, and the one who conveys it, and the one to whom it is conveyed. So the four layers of meanings in this verse, collectively, they provide different perspectives without rendering any one reading wrong or inauthentic. Ultimately, both readings are speech of Allah, so it is not allowed to prefer parts of it over others by our mere judgments. All of that is the speech of Allah. Let's look at the next example. In Surah Al Kahf, Allah says, and nothing has prevented the people from believing when guidance came to them and from seeking their Lord's forgiveness, except that there must befall them the accustomed precedent of the ancients, or that the punishment should come upon them in many types. So here also in the last word, Asim, Hamza, Kisai, and Abu Jafar read the ending of the word as qubulan, that is in many types, and the rest of the Qurra read it as qibalan, meaning face to face. So the different vowels here allow us to interpret the verse as stating that people do not believe nor ask for forgiveness until they directly face the punishment of the previous communities, or until they experience diverse forms of punishments or different types of punishments. In the next example, which is the last one, in Surah Ar-Rum, Allah says, and whatever you give in riba to increase within the wealth of the people will not increase with Allah. This verse, which talks about the gain from riba, contains two qira'at. Ibn Kathir reads the verb ataytum, meaning whatever type of riba you engage with, and the rest read with ataytum, meaning whatever you give in riba. The variation in the conjugation here reflects a change of the pattern or wasn't in two words sharing the same root. The latter reading, ataytum, unequivocally prohibits the giving of interest, whereas the former expands the explicit prohibition to any type of engagement with riba, including both giving and taking. Hence, the two readings are ultimately convergent in their meanings. And with this, we conclude our talk on the variant readings, Qira'at and Ahruf. Now we'll take a look at some of the misconceptions that come up often in the talks with non-Muslims or some Christian preachers, who want to entertain us by making videos on these topics. So the first and frequent claim is that there are multiple versions of the Quran. This is the first thing that come up when you mention the corruptions in the Bible to those who watch the evangelists on YouTube. The response to this is something we have repeated throughout the talk over and over again. Just restating it, Quran was inherently a multi-form recitation with multiple diverse, equally valid alternate readings to begin with. In other words, the Quran was taught in different ways since the time of the Prophet. This tradition was under the approval of the Prophet, and the differences are subtle and they enrich and expand the meanings, and they are harmonious with each other. And this is corroborated by the fact that we have the 7 Ahruf hadith, which is widely attested and is transmitted through different chains of narrations. So this is the response you can give to those who say that there are different versions of the Quran. Another claim is that the lost ahruf that were not included in the Uthmanic Mus'haf imply that the Quran we have today is incomplete. As we said, the Uthmanic compilation left some of the ahrufs out. So people try to say that this implies that the Quran we have today is incomplete. And the Prophet said that this Quran was revealed in 7 different harufs, so recite whichever one is easy for you. He also said that each one of the 7 haruf is sufficient. Right? This is also the words of the hadith. And Muslim scholars have known about these variance readings of companions for centuries, and they never said that it compromised the preservation of the Quran in the slightest, as we saw. At-Tabri and Tahawi, by noting that the companions understood that the reciting according to 7 ahruf was actually a concession and not an obligation. So this falls in their faces because uh, it doesn't imply that it is incomplete, because it was a rukhsa, as we mentioned. Also, Ibn Jarir Tabri mentions that the diverse reading were a concession, and therefore wasn't an obligation for Muslims to learn and transmit them all. Another claim that is brought up frequently by the Orientalists and preachers today is the Mus'haf of Ibn Masud. They try to make the most of the narration of Muslim Ahmad, which states that Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Masud did not consider the last two surahs of the Quran, Al-Falaq and An-Nas, as part of the Quran. And there are all the different books and articles talk about this that we referred to for this presentation. I'll mention some parts from the book of Mufti Taqi Uthmani on Ulum al-Quran. The fact that Abdullah ibn Masud, like the entire Ummah, considered these two surahs as part of the Quran is proved by the uninterrupted recitals from him that contain these surahs. What do I mean by that? Of the 10 recitations, the one from Asim, for instance, is quoted by Abu Abdurrahman Solami, Zir ibn Baish, Abu Amr al-Shaybani, and all of them have reported it from Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Masud. Similarly, the recitations of Hamza, Kisai, and Khalaf also go back to Abdullah ibn Masud, and all of them include the surah. So, because there is a consensus on the fact that all the reports of the 10 recitals are the most convincing and authentic report and are being transmitted uninterruptedly from generation to generation, so the isolated report, which is the report of Muslim Ahmad that the Orientalists like to use, against these must be rejected and cannot be accepted. It is on this basis that most scholars of hadith and researchers have termed the hadith of the two missing surahs as weak or invented, or at least unacceptable reports that attribute the false belief towards Abdullah ibn Masud. The scholars include Imam al-Nawawi, Ibn Hazm, Imam al-Razi, and others. Now, there are more discussions on why the narrations are not acceptable, but it's worth noting that because the narrators in this hadith are reliable, the question now remains that if these narrations are not correct, then why would the reliable narrators report such a baseless thing? The answer to this is that it is possible that although he believed them to be part of the Quran, he may have not written them in his manuscript for some reason, and the reporter of this fact may have deduced from it that he did not consider them to be the Quranic revelations. Although it was a fact that he had not written them down in spite of believing them to be part of the Quran. There could be many reasons for not writing them in his manuscripts. For instance, Allama Zahid al-Kawthari has stated that he had not written them down because there was no fear of them being forgotten. Now, remember, this is allegedly his personal mushaf, if anything, right? And every Muslim remembers them by heart. This argument is also supported, by the way, by the fact that Abdullah ibn Masud also did not write down Surah Al-Fatiha in his manuscript. And Imam Abu Bakr al-Ambari has reported that Ibn Abbas was asked about it, and he replied that if he had to write Surah Al-Fatiha, he would have written it with every surah. So Imam Abu Bakr says that this meant that since the surah is recited with every surah during Salah, he had omitted it and relied it on the memory of the Muslims. So anyhow, there can be several explanations of why he had not written those two, if we were to take the hadith on its face. But it cannot be concluded that he did not consider them to be part of the Quran, while the entire Quran has been reported from him uninterruptedly, includes these two surahs and also Al-Fatiha. And last but not the least, why did Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anhu burned the other copies of the Quran? When did he only want his version of the Quran to be propagated? This is the rhetoric they want to present. Now, when presented without context, particularly by the unlearned, this act of burning the copies almost takes a dark undertone, as though it somehow undermines the preservation of the Quranic text. But when you look at the context and the history preceding it, which, by the way, has the same exact body of sources that the critics use to cite this event, it becomes clear that Uthman's instruction is entirely expected and was, in fact, an integral part of the history of the preservation of the Quranic text. The whole point of Uthmanic project was to unify the Muslim Ummah on one Mus'haf that would eliminate confusion that was caused by the proliferation of different ahruf taught by various companions in different lands. Had he not undertaken the burning of the copies of the Quran which differed from the official copies and not eliminated a source of disputes, the entire project would have been futile. There also would have remained the possibility of individual Muslims reciting from the copies that contained scribal errors or contained commentary of companions alongside verses of the Quran. Given that it would be quite unfeasible to check and correct each and every personal codex to eliminate the issues and errors within them, the logical solution was to simply eliminate those codices that had not been copied from the Uthmanic archetypes. Now, perhaps this episode generates such confusion because, especially in the Western Hemisphere, because burning incidents in Western history are typically seen as manifestation of condemnation or desecration. For instance, after renouncing Arianism and converting to Catholicism, the king Recared ordered all the Aryan books to be collected and burned. But in the Islamic tradition, one of the respectful ways to dispose of any text containing the verses of the Quran is, in fact, through burning it. Ibn Battal writes, and Uthman's instruction to burn the manuscripts and copies of the Quran after his compilation demonstrates that it is permissible to burn the books that contain the names of Allah or Quranic verses, and that is a form of respect towards it and protection from it being stepped on upon or discarded on the ground. Um, Last point in relation, one more thing. We also have evidence that not all the manuscripts were burned. The famous Sana manuscript that you actually see here is the copy of the Quran that was erased and written over. And the time interval between the lower text and the upper text, that is the two colors you see, is very short, carbon dated to between 10 and 50 years. The upper text is consistent with the Uthmanic Codex, and the lower text has some important differences with respect to the chapter order and variant readings. And in these differences, the lower text demonstrates an incredible degree of consistency with what our traditional sources have already described to be the personal codices of companions like Abdullah ibn Masud and Ubay ibn Ka'b. So now, if Uthman ibn Affan did have any ulterior personal motives that Orientalists try to infer from this whole thing, instead of opposing or revolting his move, the companions are found to have praised him. Ali ibn Abi Talib said, "Do not speak of Uthman except with what is good. For I swear by Allah that he did not do what he did with the Masahif except with the complete approval from the rest of us." In another report, he says that, "May Allah have mercy on Uthman. Were I in charge, I would have done as he did." And that brings us to the conclusion of the talk today. Quick summary: the Quran was revealed orally in different ways to the Prophet, who recited and taught it to the Ummah in multiple ways. After he passed away, the companions compiled the different readings into one Mus'haf without diacritical marks and dottings, So some of the different approved ways could still be recited. Then the scholars came after that to compile the different qira'at from major Islamic centers to preserve the different readings. And these different readings allow for ease for different tribes and for the unlettered community to recite the Quran. And they also expand the meanings to draw multiple lessons from them. And today, anyone who learns a particular qira'ah must recite it to a qualified teacher that recited it to another in a chain that leads all the way back to the Prophet. And Muslims of all colors and stripes then can use the qira'at to connect or reconnect with the text of our holy book, finding in its every word a bottomless well of inspiration. And that concludes our talk. Jazakallahu khairan for the time and patience. And apologies again for the issues with the mic.
All right. Jazakumullah khairan, Brother Safwan, for this very informative talk. I think we can open the floor now to any questions, if anyone has any questions.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah for this explanation. I don't have a question, but I wanted if you could get this PPT so that because a lot of this was covered and it was very detailed and informative. So I just wanted to ask if we can get this PPT for these references and the earlier slides. Jazakallah.
Yes, inshallah, we'll be able to send it to everyone who signed up for the course. So yeah, inshallah, we'll send it to you.
Barakallah fi.
Assalamu alaikum, Brother Safwan. I had a question.
Walaikum assalam. Akhi, go ahead.
Yeah, so when discussing certain qira'at, so as we Muslims would say when giving da'wah, we say that the Quran is, preserved and unchanged and everything, but I'm running into a little issue if you could help me out over here. So for the slide that showed in Surah Al-Baqarah, the verse about Thamr wa Maysir, yeah, we'll go back to it. So when it says great sin and much sin, there's kabirun and kathirun. So is that would you say would that be an actual change in the word? Now I understand there's different you can change the diacritics and things like that, but when it comes to the word itself, I mean there's a bet and a tha, right? Like there's two different letters. So and is that what it was like in the manuscripts, or like how can we, like if someone brings up this contention, how would we solve it? Like if every word has been preserved, how come there's this change?
Yeah, that's a good point. So we mentioned during the talk that the Uthmanic Mus'haf did not have the diacritics or the dottings, so the harakas on the words, and also there were no vowels, so it was a consonantal text. So if you remove the diacritics and harakas and the dots from these two words, kathirun and kabirun, what do you think they would look exactly the same?
Yeah, they would, but the thing is, like, who has the authority? And I know you're probably going to say the scholars, but what gives them the authority to, yani, like, add diacritics the way? Again, this is I don't mean to be ignorant, but this is a legitimate concern for me. What would give them the authority to put in these diacritics? Now, I'm just coming from from the lens of like a detractor, so this is not really
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying myself, but I can see where a detractor can make this contention, and how would we answer to that?
I think it would help if we present to them. So first of all, to answer the question, both of the words kathirun and kabirun here comes from the Prophet, right? The Prophet either approved a recitation or he taught it that way. He taught it to the companions who taught it to their students, and among their students were the Qurra who adopted combinations of usul and first from the that they learned from the companions, and they taught it to their students. So there's
Okay.
a chain that goes back to the Prophet. That's one. And without the diacritics doesn't mean that anyone could recite it in any way. Remember, the Quran was recited and transmitted orally, right, since the beginning. So, and without the diacritics also, before, the Arabs at the time of the Prophet, they knew how to recite it. And if you remember also, Uthman ibn Affan sent a reciter, right, as we mentioned before, along with his mushaf that he sent to different provinces.
Right, right.
So I think what would help is when if we give them a picture of the whole chain that it comes from the Prophet, he either taught it this way, and why did it come from the Prophet? Like, why different recitations? Because we have the hadith of the seven ahad to make it easy and to expand on the meanings. That's the wisdom behind it. But the hadith of the seven ahad is important in that regard. So it
Okay.
was the rukhsa, and then we explained to them the chains of from the Prophet to how it reached us today.
Okay, Barakallahu Fik. So I just want to see if I understand. So this wasn't like a scholarly change. It was actually from Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam that when he recited the seven ahruf, that he then would have he would have said like these variations, these differences. Am I correct?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, none of these are the only thing that scholars did was what we say ikhtiyar. So they studied the Quran from different companions, right? And like Nafi mentions, he studied from 70 companions, and what they uh, like adopted from the companions was what uh, was their choice. They did not invent it themselves. So every word which we recite today traces back to the Prophet, word by word. The Quran was also always recited with a teacher. It was never recited alone. So the Qur'an that we have today, the ten canonical Qira'at we have today, are the students of the companions and their students, and they were the students of the Prophet.
Okay, so this was evidence in, like, for example, when the companion had recited Surah Furqan different than, I believe it was Abu Bakr, I believe. So, like, when they had recited it differently, is because that's just how Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam had revealed a different ahruf. So, would you say that would be evidence in that example?
Exactly. Yeah, we could straight up quote that hadith and say that the Prophet proved both, and it is evidence of the fact that there's a multi-point recitation.
Okay, Jazakallah khair, that answers it perfectly.
Yeah.
Uh, Safwan, I have a question. Yes. Yeah. So, can you repeat one more time what were the different understandings about the Mushaf of Uthman, and what was the stronger opinion amongst them?
Uh, Different understandings.
That if it was different readings combined in one text, I know that you mentioned it, but I was distracted at the time. I couldn't understand.
Okay, I see what you mean. Okay, the when I think when we were talking about the differences between Abu Bakr's and Uthman's copies.
No, no.
What?
Sorry. Putting it forth, so what is the understanding of what was the, or rather, let me remove that the part of the difference of opinion. What was the Uthmani Musaf?
So the Uthmani Mus'haf, it's if you understand the purpose of it, it explains it pretty clearly. Right? The people differed amongst themselves when it came to the readings. So Uthman radiallahu anhu basically limited the variations, but um, he so what happens now is not all of the there are different scholarly opinions in it, right? Some of the scholars say that all of the seven ahruf were included in it and they had to be necessarily included in it, but that is not corroborated by the evidence. So most scholars agree or believe that the Osmanic Mus'haf had some of the variations still available, and that was because of its text. Because the text was consonantal and it did not have the diacritics and the dottings in it, there were still some variations that were allowed, but we cannot say that all of the seven ahrufs were included in the Uthmanic Mus'haf.
And so they were different. So they were, for example, let's assume that they used that they allowed 4 of the Ahruf. So there were 4 different copies, or there was just one copy which had a what is the right word for it? A way that the way it was done was that you could read them in the 4 different. The text was the same.
The text was the same, yes.
Okay.
The text was the same, yes. And you could read it in different ways, but and those different ways still had to be consistent with the rasam or the text of the Uthmanic Mus'haf. And how it allows for it is actually this example that you see in the slide. Like I was mentioning to Brother Mehdi, when you look at the word kathirun and kabirun,
Yeah.
the dots and the harakas did not exist in the Uthmanic Mus'haf.
Yes, that's correct.
But the pronunciation still comes from the Prophet. So this is how the Uthmanic Mus'haf allows for both of these pronunciations.
Okay, Jazakallah khair, Ustaz.
Brother Ahmed.
Can you hear me?
Walaikum Assalam. Yes.
Barakallah fiqh for the presentation, very informative. I just had a couple of hopefully quick questions. I was hoping you can answer. The first one, and sorry if you mentioned it already, but the 10 qira'at, were they? Did you mention that each of the 10 were fully recited by the entire Quran was recited fully in each of the 10 qira'at to the companions by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam?
What we have of the 10 qira'at was all of it goes back to the Prophet. Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm more so wondering the entire Quran is revealed, right? And it's recited by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to the companions. In each of the qira'at, it was the entire thing, like the entire Quran recited to the companions, or is it like parts of it was recited in this qira'ah and then other parts were in this qira'ah, and then to find the rules for that qira'ah, is it just like kind of expanded to the whole Quran? I don't know if that makes sense.
That's a good point, actually. In cases of, so you remember in the Qira'at when we were explaining in the very beginning, these 2 rules basically in cases of usul, these are general applications that that can be applied throughout the Quran. So this was part of the ruqsa. But for furush, in cases where the variation of words would have a different meanings, for instance, they would have to be from the Prophet. But even in cases of usul, uh, in pretty much all of the cases, or most of the cases, you can say, the small differences in the tawatur, actually, the scholars that have mentioned, are the vowelization of mad, for instance. Like how much are you going to stretch uh, or are you going to stretch the mud to two vowels or three vowels? It's just that part that uh, you know was taken by the Qurra, but the Prophet gave license for this also. So he did not necessarily show every recitation, but the furush, in cases where the variation have occur within words, they have to be from the Prophet.
I see. Okay. Barakallah fiqh. And then I was wondering if I know so I've heard the term before when you're learning tajweed and studying into it. There's within I think it's within Hafs and Asim. There's a tariqa shatibiyya and things like that. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Could you explain a little bit about what that is?
Um, the tariq, you mean, right? Yes, actually, um, turuq are something that follows from the rawis. They are basically so we have a dual rawi system, right? That was developed for the qurra. One qurra would have two most popular students that were the rawis, and turuq were synthesized as channel to preserve each and every authentic mode of recitation or points of articulation. Um, so we can say that every variation that is attributed to the 10 readers or the 10 qurra, which his students agreed upon, is considered a qira'ah. Every variation that is attributed to a reader's transmitter, a rawi, is considered a narration or riwayah. And every variation that is attributed to transmitter student, regardless of the length or the chain of transmitters, is considered a tariq.
I see. So to categorize it would go from qari to rawi to tariq. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. And I apologize. I just have one more quick question. Um, just the changes in the differences in the different qira'at. Is it there are only differences? Like I know that you were mentioned earlier in the example of kathir and kabir. So there are only changes when it's not without the harakat and like the I forget the other term you mentioned, the diacritics, is it? So the changes are like the word in itself, like the actual like the lines. Are they going to be the same between the different qira'at, or can that also be different?
The consonantal text remains the same. So what this means is, if a word only consists of consonants, then yes. But the Uthmanic Mus'haf did not include vowels either. So if there's vowels in some word, then we do see differences in that also. So for instance, wow, uh, alif in some qiraat, and removal of them in others, we do see that.
Okay, and so for just the consonantal text, that remains the same between the different qira'at. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Okay, Barakallah.
But
Thank you. Oh,
well,
sorry,
yeah, it's important to note that again, like even the differences of vowels, if it's added, subtracted, removed, all of these are either taught by the Prophet or approved by him.
Okay, I see. Yep. Barakallah. Thank you so much.
Can I jump in on another question? Actually, I got so about the skeletal text. Why was it not written with the diacritics? So why did the scribes I don't think they omitted them, in my opinion, but I just want to know how come they just weren't there at the start.
Because the Arabs didn't used to write them. So this is related to the evolution of the language and making it easy for the non-Arabs to understand. In fact, when the diacritics were included in the beginning, they were included in a different way. Like you know how you have dashes for the dhamma and kasra and so on. The pointers or the notations were different. So for us, it seems difficult, but for Arabs, it was natural. They understood what was meant or how to read a particular word,
Okay.
and add to that the recitation and approval of the Prophet.
Okay, and do you know like historically when the diacritics were like standardized or like they became a thing?
I think it was. I'm not sure of the time. I think it was a few centuries later. Maybe someone would know, but I'm not entirely sure. Probably within the first century.
So there's a few things to say there. Um, it is said that actually there are certain earlier manuscripts, really early manuscripts, that do contain some dotting. And the reason that the Uthmanic copy did not have the dots or the diacritics was intentional to allow the accommodation of different recitations into the text. Because if you added the dots, you locked in one recitation. But if you remove the dots, you allow multiple recitations. And that wasn't an accident, that was intentional. So that's one opinion. And it is supported by the fact that some of the Sahaba's manuscripts, like the really early manuscripts, I mean, do contain some dotting. As for when dots came around, it is said that it happened during the time of like the Umayyad Caliphate, in the time of Abdul Malik bin Marwan. I think it was Abu al-Aswad al-Du'ali who was tasked with first making the dotting. I think Ahmed has something to add on to that as well.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Barakallah fiqh. But for example, when I look at Aramaic, some Aramaic does have diacritics, so that's like kind of I don't know. It's it's a much earlier language than Arabic, and I don't see a lot of Aramaic text with diacritics, but some of it does have. And I can't say the same for Hebrew though, because Hebrew diacritics came in much later, like I believe like ninth century or something. But the question remains though, like for how come Aramaic had diacritics and Arabic came, even though it was a language that came later, still how come the diacritics weren't presented until after canonization? Sorry if I'm asking too many questions. I don't want to hold up anyone's time.